She found it at 2:47 in the morning, wedged behind the bottom drawer of the senior partner's desk, like someone had tucked it there in a hurry and told themselves they would come back for it later. Celeste Thibodeau had been cleaning the 14th floor of the Webb and Associates building for 3 years. She knew every surface in that office, the way you know the back of your own hand, the coffee ring that never fully came out of the credenza, the spot near the window where the carpet frayed, just enough to catch a mop wheel, the particular way the leather chairs held the smell of expensive cologne long after the men who wore it had gone home. She knew this floor. She knew what belonged on it and what did not. The envelope did not belong. It was manila, letter-sized, unsealed. No name on the front. She picked it up the same way she picked up everything else on her rotation, without ceremony, without curiosity, the practiced efficiency of a woman who had learned that the fastest way through a 12-hour shift was to keep moving. She was halfway to the trash bag when she felt the weight of it. She stopped. She set the bag down. She opened the envelope. The money was bundled in neat stacks, the kind of neat that comes from a counting machine, not human hands. She counted once, moving through the bills with her thumb the way her father had taught her to count anything worth counting slowly, without rushing, because a mistake in the count was a mistake you owned. $65,000. She counted again. Same number, same result. She set the envelope on the edge of the desk and took 3 steps back from it. For 4 minutes, she stood in the middle of that office and looked at it the way you look at something that could rewrite the next 10 years of your life if you let it. She thought about Isaiah, her 6-year-old son, whose hearing aids needed replacing before winter, whose speech therapist had told her 2 sessions a week was the minimum, and the waiting list for state-funded care ran anywhere from 8 to 14 months. She thought about her mother, who had a chemotherapy appointment the following Tuesday, and a medical bill from the last one still sitting unopened on the kitchen counter, because opening it did not change what was inside. She thought about the rent, which was due in 11 days, and the number in her checking account, which was not a number that made 11 days feel like enough time. She thought about all of it. She stood there and let herself think about every single piece of it. Then she folded the envelope in half, slid it into the inside pocket of her work jacket, and went back to mopping the floor. She finished the 14th floor. She moved to the service stairwell and took it down to 13, then 12. She cleaned 2 executive bathrooms and a hallway that smelled like the ghost of a catered lunch. She emptied wastebaskets that held the crumpled drafts of arguments worth more than her annual salary. She worked the way she always worked, methodically, completely, without leaving a surface unfinished. 45 minutes passed. At 5:55 in the morning, 11 minutes before the end of her shift, Celeste stopped at the first-floor security desk. The night guard, a heavy-set man in his 50s, who had nodded at her every morning for 3 years, without ever learning her name, looked up from his screen. She reached into her jacket. She placed the envelope on the desk in front of him. She took the incident report form he slid toward her, and she filled it out in full location. Time of discovery, condition of the item. In the description field, she wrote 7 words found in senior partner office, 14th floor. She signed her name at the bottom, Celeste Thibodeau. Clear and even, the way her mother had taught her to sign anything official, like you mean it, like you have nothing to hide. She walked back to the service corridor. She clocked out at 6:01. She did not look back. 3 floors above the lobby, in the corner of the senior partner's office, where the baseboard met the ceiling, trim, a small red light blinked twice in the dark. The building's internal camera had been recording since the moment she walked through that door. Every second of it, every counted bill, every step away, and every step back. Someone, somewhere in that building, had already seen all of it. The house on Delon Street was quiet, in the way that only houses with exhausted people inside them can be not peaceful exactly, but held together by the specific stillness of people who had run out of words before they ran out of night. Celeste pushed through the front door at 6:15, easing it shut behind her with both hands so the latch caught without sound. It was a habit she had developed without deciding to, the same way she had developed most of her habits through repetition, through necessity, through the slow accumulation of mornings when waking someone up early meant one more thing she did not have the energy to manage. The living room was dim. The curtains were the heavy kind, the ones she had found at a second-hand shop on Magazine Street 2 winters ago, because Isaiah was sensitive to early light, and she had learned that a well-rested child was the difference between a morning that worked and one that did not. She moved through the familiar dark without turning on a lamp. She stopped at the doorway of the room her son shared with no one. Isaiah was 6 years old and small for his age, the kind of small that made strangers want to be gentle around him. Before they understood that gentleness was not what he needed to be taken seriously, which was different. He was asleep on his back, with one arm stretched toward the edge of the mattress and a drawing pressed flat against his chest, held there by the unconscious grip of a child who had fallen asleep mid-creation. The crayon was still in his other hand. Blue, his favorite lately. On the nightstand beside him, placed with a care that no 6-year-old applied to anything by accident, sat his hearing aids. Both of them, aligned parallel to each other on a folded square of paper towel, the way Celeste had shown him, because they were expensive and irreplaceable, and because the waiting list for replacements through their insurance ran 4 to 6 months. And she had explained this to him in the plainest terms she knew how to use with a child his age. He had listened. He always listened. He just did not always have the words to show it. She pulled his blanket up to his shoulders without waking him. She stood there for a moment, longer than she needed to. From the back bedroom came the sound that had become the rhythm of her mornings, a low, measured cough, the kind that had stopped being alarming only because she had heard it enough times to map its pattern. Her mother, Claudette Thibodeau, Mama T, as the neighborhood had called her since before Celeste was born, was 61 years old and in her second round of chemotherapy for a diagnosis that the oncologist described with careful optimism, and that Celeste translated privately as "we are doing what we can." The cough meant she was awake. It meant the night had been long. It did not mean anything worse than that, and Celeste had trained herself to stop at that boundary and not cross it. She filled a glass of water in the kitchen and left it on the small table outside her mother's door. She did not knock. Mama Thee would find it when she was ready. The front door was open, not broken open, not left carelessly, just unlatched, the screen door doing the work of keeping the morning out, while the wooden door stood wide behind it. Her younger brother Darius was on the porch steps, still in the clothes he had worn the day before, his forearms resting on his knees, and his eyes fixed on the far end of the block, where Delonde met the cross street, and the world beyond it went about its business without asking his permission. Darius was 29 years old and had been out of a correctional facility in central Louisiana for exactly 3 weeks. He did not talk about the 5 years he had spent there. He talked instead about the jobs he had applied for since coming home: framing crews, warehouse logistics, a kitchen prep position at a restaurant on Magazine Street that had seemed briefly like a real possibility. 7 applications, 7 rejections. Some of them form letters. 2 of them, not even that. He did not look up when she sat down beside him on the steps. She did not ask how he was doing. They had grown up in a house where that question was a luxury. You could see how someone was doing by looking at them, and asking out loud only made it harder for both of you. They sat together in the particular silence of 2 people who share a history long enough to make words optional. Then his phone lit up on the step beside him. He looked at the screen without picking it up. Celeste watched his jaw tighten in the way it did when he was calculating something he did not want to calculate out loud. The call rang through, stopped. The screen went dark. 30 seconds later, it lit up again. Same number, no name attached to it. Just 10 digits that did not belong to anyone in his contacts. Darius picked the phone up this time. He looked at it the way you look at something you already know is going to be a problem. The way you look at a door you are not sure you should open. The screen kept glowing in his hand. The call rang on. He did not answer, but he did not put it down either. The kitchen light was the only one on in the house. Celeste had been sitting at the table for 20 minutes with a pen she had not written anything with yet, and a piece of paper she already knew the ending of. It was the same piece of paper, more or less, that she had been working on for the past 3 years. Different numbers in the boxes, same result at the bottom. The result was always the same. The result was that the numbers on the left side of the equation were larger than the number on the right, and no amount of rearranging them changed that fundamental fact. She wrote them down anyway. She had learned somewhere along the way that writing things down made them real, in a way that was necessary before you could deal with them. Denial was a luxury she could not afford any more than she could afford the things on the list. Chemotherapy, second round, $2,400 per treatment cycle after insurance. The insurance she carried through the cleaning company covered 60% of outpatient oncology, which sounded generous until you did the math on the remaining 40 and realized that percentages were a way of making large numbers feel smaller without actually making them smaller. Isaiah's hearing aids, $3,800 for replacement devices because the ones he had were 2 years old, and the audiologist had told her at his last appointment that the left one was losing its calibration in the upper frequency range, the range that carried consonants, the range that carried the difference between words that sounded the same but meant different things. She had nodded and written it down and not said anything about the $3,800 out loud. Rent, $980 due in 11 days, subsidized through a federal housing program that she had waited 2 years and 4 months to access, and that could be revoked for reasons as administrative and impersonal as a missed recertification deadline. She added the column. She already knew the sum. She wrote it down anyway. Her father had been a man who believed that a thing done right was worth doing slowly. Reginald Thibodeau worked electrical contracting for 31 years, pulling wire through walls, in houses across the city houses, in Metairie and Lakeview, and the Garden District houses, with kitchens larger than the entire ground floor of the place he came home to every night. He never complained about the disparity. He said that a man's work was his word, and his word was the same, regardless of whose house he was standing in. He had one rule. He repeated so often, it stopped sounding like a rule, and started sounding like weather, something that was simply present always, the way humidity was present in a New Orleans summer. What's not yours is not yours, even if it's left wide open. He said it the first time she could remember, when she was 8 years old, standing in the cereal aisle of the Winn-Dixie on St. Claude Avenue. She had found a $20 bill on the floor, between 2 shelves, crisp and folded, like someone had set it down gently on purpose. She had looked up at her father with the face of a child who believes the universe has just done something kind. He walked her to the customer service desk. She handed it to the woman behind the counter, who looked at Reginald like he had asked her to solve an equation she had not signed up to solve. He did not react to her expression. He thanked her. He took Celeste back to finish the shopping. She never forgot the way his hand felt around hers when they walked away from that counter. Not tight, not pulling, just there. Reginald died on a Tuesday in October, on a job site in Gentilly, from a stroke that came without warning and ended before the ambulance arrived. Celeste was 19 and in her second semester at the University of New Orleans, studying business administration on a partial academic scholarship that required her to maintain full-time enrollment to keep the funding. Her father's income had covered the gap between the scholarship and the actual cost of being a student. When he was gone, so was the gap coverage. She withdrew from her courses 4 days after the funeral. Not because she wanted to, because the math changed the moment he stopped being in it, and the new math did not include a classroom. The water line on the kitchen wall was not something she thought about consciously anymore. It was just there the way the creak in the second porch step was just there the way the draft under the back door in January was just there, a feature of the place, part of the texture of living in a house that had been through something and kept standing anyway. The line sat at 4 feet 2 inches above the floor. She knew the measurement because she had measured it herself at age 16, 2 weeks after the water from the federal canal levee receded enough to walk through the first floor without boots. The family had stayed. They had no money to evacuate and nowhere specific to go. And her father had made the calculation that the house was solid and the family was together and that those two things had to be enough. They were enough, barely, but enough. She looked at the numbers on the paper in front of her. She looked at the waterline on the wall. She picked up the pen and drew a small line through the total, the way her father used to cross out the things on his work orders that were finished, clean, decisive, final. It did not change the number, but it was something. Somewhere above, her 14 floors, up in a building she had spent 3 years making clean for people who never learned her name. A small red light blinked twice in the dark. The camera on the 14th floor had been recording since before she arrived for her shift. It was still recording now, every frame of it stored somewhere she could not see, watched by someone she did not know existed. The city was already awake, 14 floors below, but Marcus Webb had been awake longer than the city. He had arrived at his office at 6:30 that morning, not because anything required him to, not because a meeting was scheduled or a deadline was pressing, but because the alternative was lying in a bed in a house on Prytania Street that had too many rooms for one person and too much silence for a man whose mind did not know how to stop moving. He had made coffee in the small kitchen off the main conference room, the good kind, the kind his assistant kept stocked without being asked, and he had sat down at his desk and opened his laptop and stared at the screen for several minutes without reading anything on it. Marcus Webb was 64 years old and had spent the better part of 4 decades building Webb and Associates from a 2-person operation in a rented office on Poydras Street into one of the most recognized litigation firms in Louisiana. He was not a man who struggled with sleepless nights as a general rule. He was a man who solved problems, and problems, in his experience, had solutions, if you were willing to work the angles long enough. What he was not good at, what he had never been good at, even when Patricia was alive, and would point it out to him in the direct, unhurried way she had of saying the true thing without apology, was sitting still when something did not add up. Something did not add up. He pulled up the building's internal security feed at 7:03 and navigated to the 14th floor camera timestamp starting at 2:30 that morning. He found what he was looking for inside the first few minutes of footage. A woman in a gray cleaning uniform entered the senior partner's office at 2:47. She moved through the room with the efficient, unhurried pace of someone who had done this exact job in this exact space enough times that her body knew the route without her having to think about it. She reached the desk. She opened the bottom drawer. She removed something, an envelope from the look of it, and held it for a moment before opening it. He watched her count. He watched her stop, set the envelope down, step back from it. He watched her stand in the middle of that office for 4 minutes without touching anything. Then he watched her pick the envelope up, put it inside her jacket, and go back to mopping the floor as if nothing had happened. As if she had simply decided the universe was going to have to wait while she finished what she came there to do. He replayed that sequence 2 more times. 3 total. He was not sure what he was looking for. On the second and third viewing's confirmation, maybe that he had seen what he thought he had seen. That a person had found something in that building and made a decision with it that he could not immediately categorize. He had spent his entire professional life categorizing decisions. He understood calculated ones and impulsive ones, and ones made from fear and ones made from greed. He did not have a clean category for this. At 7:22, he picked up his phone and called Diana Reeves, his personal assistant, a woman in her late 40s who had worked for him for 11 years and who understood, without being told, the difference between matters that went through official firm channels and matters that did not. "I need a name," he said. "Night cleaning rotation, 14th floor. Last night." She called back in 14 minutes. "Celeste Thibodeau," Diana said. 3 years on staff. Night shift custodial. Her address on file is in the lower 9th ward. He wrote the name down on the legal pad beside his keyboard. Then he wrote the address. He looked at it. Something moved in the back of his mind, slow and formless, the way a memory announces itself before you can actually see it. He knew that address, in some way, he could not immediately locate. Not the specific number, but the street, the neighborhood, the particular coordinates of it in the geography of the city. He had encountered it somewhere before, in some context, that his mind was not yet willing to surface. He sat with the feeling for a moment, trying to let it clarify. It did not clarify. It just sat there, familiar and unnamed, like a word on the tip of your tongue that leaves the moment you reach for it. He was still looking at the address when the door to his office opened. His son did not knock. He never knocked. Ethan Webb was 31 years old and a junior partner at the firm his father had built, and he moved through the building with the particular ease of someone who has never had to consider whether a space belongs to him. He stepped inside with a cup of coffee in one hand and something approximating a good morning on his face. Then his eyes moved to the laptop screen, to the legal pad, to the name written on it in his father's handwriting. The expression that crossed his face lasted less than 2 seconds. It was not alarm exactly, and it was not recognition exactly. It was something that sat precisely between the two, something that came and went so quickly that a person not paying close attention would have missed it entirely. Marcus was not paying close attention. He was still looking at the address. He pulled the door shut behind him, with both hands, guiding the latch into place, with the kind of care that had nothing to do with courtesy and everything to do with control. The click it made was barely audible. That was the point. Ethan Webb walked the length of the hallway to the elevator bank at a pace that was not quite hurrying, but was not leisurely either. The pace of a man who had somewhere to be and did not want anyone to notice how much he needed to get there. He rode the elevator down 2 floors alone, stepped off into the corridor that led to his own office, and closed that door behind him as well. This time, he did not bother with the same precision. He just needed it shut. He did not sit down. He stood at the window for a moment, with his back to the room, looking out at the city, coming fully alive in the morning light, and he did something he very rarely did. He thought backward. The envelope had been in that drawer for 11 days. He knew the exact number, because he had put it there himself, on a Wednesday evening after a private meeting that had run long and ended with a handshake and a set of wire transfer instructions that he had since executed through a separate account. The cash had been part of an arrangement that was in the technical language of the law his father had spent a lifetime practicing inadvisable. In the plain language that Ethan preferred when he was being honest with himself, it was the kind of arrangement that required the cash to disappear quietly and completely before the firm's quarterly audit, which was scheduled to begin the following Monday. The money belonged on paper and in practice to a family named Williams. They were clients of the firm, or had been for 7 years, through a property dispute in the lower 9th Ward that had finally resolved in their favor 8 months ago. The settlement funds had cleared into the firm's escrow account. Ethan had moved them, not all at once, not in a way that would trigger an automatic review. He had been careful. He was always careful. What he had not been was attentive. He had left the envelope in the drawer because he had meant to retrieve it the same evening, and had instead taken a call that lasted 2 hours, and then flown to Dallas the following morning for a deposition that ran 3 days. By the time he was back in New Orleans and back in that office, the envelope was part of the furniture. Background, invisible in the way that things become invisible when you stop expecting them to cause problems. He picked up his personal cell phone, not the one registered to the firm, the other one, and dialed a number that was not saved under any name in his contacts. It rang twice. "We have a problem," he said when the line connected. The envelope was turned in. Night cleaning staff. The building's security has it logged. The voice on the other end asked one question. "I'm finding out now," Ethan said, and ended the call. He sat down at his desk and opened his laptop. He pulled up the building's HR directory through a back-end access point that technically required authorization. He did not technically have, and he ran the name, His father had written on that legal pad. He had read it upside down in the 2 seconds he'd had before composing his expression against the night shift custodial roster. He found her file in under a minute. Then he picked up his desk phone and called Carter, his personal assistant, a young man of 26 whose primary qualification, as far as Ethan was concerned, was an ability to find information quickly and forget it just as fast. "I need everything on a woman named Celeste Thibodeau," he said. "Current address, employment history, anyone she lives with, anyone she's connected to. I need it in 20 minutes. Carter called back in 19. "She's got a brother," Carter said. "Darius Thibodeau, 29 years old. He completed a 5-year sentence at a state correctional facility in central Louisiana about 3 weeks ago. Released on standard supervision terms." Ethan opened the summary document Carter had attached to the message. He read through it the way he read through everything, quickly, efficiently, looking not for what was there, but for what was useful. A man recently released from a long stretch at a state facility. No steady employment yet, living with family, financially dependent, operating under the terms of supervised release, which meant any new legal entanglement carried consequences that extended well beyond the immediate situation. He read it once more to be sure he had understood it correctly. He had. He closed the laptop. The room went darker by one screen's worth of light. He sat back in his chair and let the silence of the office settle around him. And somewhere in the space between what he knew and what he intended to do with it, something shifted in his face. Not quite a smile, not quite satisfaction, but something adjacent to both. The kind of look that meant he had found the angle. The message came in at 11:07, 1 hour, before she was supposed to leave for her shift. Celeste was sitting on the edge of her bed in the dark, lacing up her work boots the way she did every night, left foot first double knot. Checked the tension at the toe when her phone lit up on the nightstand. She reached for it out of habit, the automatic reflex of someone whose phone calls at odd hours were rarely good news, but always required attention. 4 words on the screen, no name attached to the number, no area code she recognized. "You should have kept it." She read it twice. Not because she did not understand it the first time, but because understanding something and accepting that it is real are 2 different processes, and her mind needed the second pass to complete the second one. She deleted the message. Her thumb moved across the screen. With the same deliberate calm, she brought to everything she did not want to show on her face. But her hands were cold in a way that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room, and she sat with that for a moment before she stood up. She walked down the hall and knocked on her brother's door. 2 knocks quiet. The kind that said, "I need you awake," not "I need you alarmed." Darius opened it almost immediately, which told her he had not been asleep. He was still dressed, sitting on the edge of his own bed, the way she had just been sitting on hers, and the look on his face, when he saw her expression, was the look of a man who had been waiting for something to arrive and was not surprised that it finally had. She showed him the screen. The message was deleted, but she had memorized it and typed it again into a notes app, so she would not second-guess herself later. He read it. He did not react the way she expected. No sharp intake of breath, no question about who sent it. He just nodded slowly and set the phone down on the bed between them. 3 days ago, he said. Outside the corner store on Claiborne. She waited. A man had approached him, Darius explained. Someone he did not recognize, dressed plainly. Nothing about him that would make you look twice on a busy street. The man had known his name. He had known where Darius was staying and where his sister worked. He had asked in the careful language of someone who understood exactly what they were implying, without saying it directly, whether Darius knew anything about an incident at the Webb and Associates building the previous Thursday night, whether his sister had mentioned finding anything, whether she had talked to anyone about it. Darius had said no to all 3 questions, which was the truth at the time. The man had given him a number to call if anything came to mind. Then he had walked away without looking back, the way people walk away when they are confident the conversation is not over. Darius had not told Celeste, because he had told himself it was nothing. He had told himself that enough times over the past 3 days that he had almost started to believe it. Celeste listened to all of this without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she got up and went to the kitchen drawer where she kept her work documents, pay stubs, shift schedules, the carbon copy of the incident report she had filed with building security 2 nights ago. She pulled the report out and read through it under the kitchen light. Her signature was at the bottom, clear and even the way her mother had taught her. The description field contained the 7 words she had written, found in senior partner office, 14th floor. There was no mention of the note inside the envelope, no mention of the word printed on it. She had not read it closely enough to register it at the time. She had seen it the way you see something in your peripheral vision, without processing it, and moved on. But her signature was still there, her name on a document that confirmed she had been alone in that office with that envelope for long enough to read whatever was inside it. "They think I read it," she said, not to Darius specifically, not to herself specifically, just out loud because saying it completed the thought. "They think I know what's on that paper." She picked up her phone and typed the firm's name into a search browser. Webb and Associates had a public profile case, history partner, listings a record of notable settlements that went back decades. She scrolled through it methodically, the way her father had taught her to read anything important slowly, without skipping, because the detail that matters is usually the one that looks unimportant until it isn't. She found 3 references to Lower Ninth Ward property litigation. She screenshotted each one. She opened a notes document and began writing down names, dates, and case numbers in the plain shorthand she had developed for herself over years of managing more information than she had storage space for. The public library on St. Claude Avenue opened at 9 in the morning. The legal archives were on the 2nd floor. She had been there before for Isaiah's early intervention paperwork, for her mother's insurance appeals, and she knew the reference desk opened 15 minutes before the general floor. She would be there at 8:45. She was still writing when the sound came from the hallway, outside the front door. Footsteps, unhurried, the particular cadence of someone who was not passing through but had arrived somewhere and was deciding what to do about it. They stopped directly outside. The silence that followed was a different kind of silence than the one that had been in the house all evening, thicker with something in it. No knock came. Darius was already on his feet. 2 days had passed since he wrote the name on that legal pad, and Marcus Webb still could not explain what he was doing on the other side of the city at 7 o'clock on a Saturday morning. He had told himself, pulling out of the driveway on Britannia Street in the gray, early light, that he was taking a drive. That was all. A man was allowed to take a drive. He had not told himself where he was going because he had not wanted to examine the answer too closely. And so he had simply driven down St. Charles, through the Marigny, across the bridge at Claiborne, and let his hands find the route, while his mind stayed carefully, deliberately, uninvolved. He parked on a side street off Delonde and sat with the engine running for several minutes before he turned it off. The neighborhood was not what he had expected, and he understood sitting there that his expectation had been the problem. He had imagined something uniformly broken, the kind of place that confirmed a particular story about certain parts of certain cities. What he found instead was more complicated, and because of that, harder to look at directly. There were houses here that bore the unmistakable marks of a flooding that had happened nearly 2 decades ago, water lines on exterior walls, foundations that had shifted and never been corrected, front steps that leaned at angles the original builders had not intended. But there were also houses that had been rebuilt from the ground up, small and neat, and clearly loved their front yards, holding the particular kind of order that comes from people who have decided that what they have is worth maintaining. And between them, at irregular intervals, were empty lots where houses had once stood, rectangles of overgrown grass and bare earth that the city had not filled and the neighborhood had not forgotten. He was looking at one of those empty lots when the door of the house across the street opened. The woman who came out was somewhere in her early 60s, wearing a housecoat in a faded floral pattern and a pair of slippers that had seen better years. She moved with the careful, measured pace of someone whose body was asking her to slow down and who was in the process of negotiating that request. She carried a small plastic watering can, the kind you buy at a dollar store, and she made her way to a cluster of potted plants arranged along the top porch step with the deliberate attention of someone performing a task that mattered to them, regardless of whether it mattered to anyone else. Claudette Thibodeau, Mama T as she had been known on this block, for the better part of 30 years, had lived in that house, through things that would have moved most people elsewhere. She had stayed through the storm, and through the water, and through the years of slow, incomplete recovery that followed. She had buried a husband and raised 2 children, largely on the schedule that grief and necessity had set for her. And she had planted those pots on those steps because she had decided somewhere in the middle of all of it that growing something was an act of insistence, a way of saying that what happened here was not the last word. Marcus lowered his window. He had not planned to speak to anyone. He heard himself speak anyway. "Excuse me," he said. "I think I might have taken a wrong turn somewhere back on Claiborne. I'm trying to find my way back toward the interstate." She looked up from her watering can with the unhurried attention of a woman who had no particular reason to be in a rush and had long since stopped pretending otherwise. She gave him directions, clear, specific, the kind that came from someone who knew every traffic pattern and shortcut in a neighborhood the way you know the rooms of a house you have lived in for decades. And then, because she was the kind of person who did not see any reason to stop a conversation at the strictly functional point, she kept talking. She talked about the block, about the family 2 doors down, who had finally finished rebuilding last spring after 17 years of trying to get the permits and the financing to line up at the same time. About the empty lot he had been looking at, which had belonged to a family named Arsenault before the courts took it. Not the storm, she was careful to say. The courts, years before the storm, as part of a broader action that had moved a lot of families out of a lot of houses in ways that the paperwork made look orderly, even when the reality was anything but. Marcus listened. He did not interrupt. He had been a litigator for 4 decades, and he understood at a level below conscious thought that the most important information in any conversation was usually the information the other person offered without being asked. "Did you know a family named Thibodeau in this neighborhood?" he said when she paused. He kept his voice neutral, curious the way a person is curious about a place they have just stumbled into. She stopped watering. She looked at him the way people look at something that has arrived too specifically to be accidental, with attention that had sharpened suddenly past the point of ordinary conversation. "That's my name," she said. "Why?" The word landed in the space between them and sat there. Marcus held her gaze for 1 second, too long enough to understand that whatever he said next would be remembered and repeated. He thanked her for the directions. He raised his window. He pulled away from the curb at the same unhurried pace he had arrived at, signaling properly at the corner, merging back into the thin Saturday morning traffic, as if he were simply a man who had been lost and was now found. In the rearview mirror, she was still standing at the top of her porch steps with the watering can held at her side, watching the car move down the street until it turned and was gone. She had not moved. She was the kind of woman who did not move until she understood what she had just seen. He drove back through the city without the radio on. That was unusual for him. Marcus Webb was not a man who tolerated silence in a moving vehicle. He used drive time, the way he used every other unscheduled interval, as an opportunity to think through something that needed thinking through, and the radio provided the kind of low-level noise that kept the thinking productive without becoming a distraction. But the ride back from the lower Ninth Ward that morning was different. He did not want noise. He wanted to hear whatever it was that the morning had put in his head and had not yet finished saying. He was back at the office on Canal Street by 9:30. The building was empty on Saturdays, except for the security desk and whatever attorneys had briefs due Monday morning. He took the elevator to the 14th floor, walked past his own office, and kept going down the corridor to the door at the far end that led to the firm's document storage room. The 1993 files were in the 3rd row, 2nd shelf, from the bottom, in a banker's box that still had the original case number written on the side in his own handwriting from 30 years ago. He recognized the handwriting before he recognized the number. That was the thing about your own past. Sometimes you met it in the details before you met it in the facts. He carried the box to the conference table and opened it. There was a version of Marcus Webb that the junior partners and the associates and the clients who retained the firm did not know existed, because that version had been carefully and deliberately left behind. He had grown up in Baton Rouge, in a house where the electricity was a negotiation, and new shoes were a once-a-year event, if the year had been good enough to allow it. He had learned to read on books borrowed from a neighbor 2 streets over, and returned before they were missed. He had written his multiplication tables on the inside of a grocery bag, because notebooks cost money, and the bag was free. He had gotten out on academic merit and the particular determination of someone who understood at an age when most children do not think about such things, that the distance between where he was and where he intended to be was navigable only by exceptional performance. He had performed exceptionally. He had not looked back. The law had made sense to him from the first semester, not because of any idealism about justice, but because it was a system with rules, and systems with rules rewarded people who understood those rules better than everyone else in the room. He had been the best in every room he entered. He had made sure of it. He met Patricia in the spring of 1989 at Charity Hospital at 2 in the morning when he had come in with a hand he had cut badly on a broken glass, and she was the nurse who cleaned and dressed the wound with an efficiency that suggested she had more important things to attend to, and a thoroughness that suggested she was not going to let that show in her work. She had asked him what he did. He had told her. She had said without looking up from the bandage that it must be interesting work being the person in the room who decided how other people's problems got resolved. He had thought about that sentence for 3 days afterward. Then he had gone back to the hospital on her next shift and asked her to have coffee with him. Patricia was a woman who said the true thing, not cruelly, not carelessly, but with the direct and unhurried precision of someone who considered honesty a form of respect. In 22 years of marriage, she had been the only person in his life who reliably told him what she actually thought, and he had valued that even when, especially, when what she thought was not what he wanted to hear. In the fall of 1993, he won the largest case of his career to that point, a property consolidation action representing a commercial development group with interests in several blocks of the lower Ninth Ward. The judgment was clean, the appeal was unsuccessful, and the result was that 212 families received relocation notices within 60 days of the ruling. It was, by every professional metric he applied to such things, an excellent outcome. Patricia made dinner that night. She set the table. She sat down across from him and let him talk through the details of the verdict for several minutes before she put her fork down and looked at him in the particular way she had, not angry, not accusatory, just clear. 200 families, Marcus, she said. 200 families went home tonight to figure out what comes next, and you came home to celebrate. He had said something about the law, about the process being sound, and the judgment being correct, and the clients having a legitimate claim. He had said it well, the way he said everything well, because he had spent his entire adult life learning to construct arguments that held together under pressure. Patricia had listened to all of it. Then she said, "The people you beat in court go home to something real, Marcus. What do you go home to?" He had not answered that question to her satisfaction then. He was not sure he had answered it to his own satisfaction since. He turned to the last page of the 1993 file. It was a spreadsheet printed on paper that had gone slightly yellow at the edges. 212 rows, each one a household. Name, address, number of occupants, date of notice served. He ran his finger down the list. Row 47. Reginald Thibodeau, Clarice Thibodeau. 2 minor children. Address on Delon Street, Lower Ninth Ward. He read it once. He read it again. He sat back in his chair and looked at the water stain on the ceiling of the conference room that had been there for as long as he could remember, and that no one had ever gotten around to fixing. He already knew which door he was going to knock on in the morning. He had known it. He understood now, since the moment a woman's voice on a residential street had said, "That's my name," and the air between them had changed into something neither of them had been prepared for. He parked on the street and walked to the door without sitting in the car first. That was a deliberate choice. He had learned over 4 decades of walking into rooms where the other side was not going to be happy to see him. That hesitation read, people could tell when you had been sitting outside, working up the nerve, the same way they could tell when a witness had rehearsed an answer. Too many times there was a particular quality to the delivery that gave it away. He walked to the door of 412 DeLone Street at 9:15 on a Sunday morning the same way he walked into a courtroom, like he had already decided to be there, and the only thing left was to show up. He knocked twice, waited. The woman who opened the door was not surprised to see a stranger. She was surprised to see this particular stranger. He could see it in the fraction of a second before her expression settled into something more guarded and more measured. She was still in the clothes of someone who had not planned on company. A plain dark sweatshirt and work pants, her hair pulled back with the practical efficiency of a person who did not have time to think about their hair. She looked at him the way she had probably learned to look at unexpected things directly, without giving anything away, waiting for information before committing to a response. "My name is Marcus Webb," he said. "I own the building where you work." She did not say anything. She held the door at an angle that let her see him fully, without opening it wide enough for him to see much past her. "I know you returned the envelope," he said. "I know your situation. I came because I have something I'd like to discuss with you, and I think it's worth your time to hear it." She looked at him for a long moment, not sizing him up the way people sized up someone they were deciding whether to trust. She was past that already. She was deciding something else, something more specific. "Why does a man like you come to a door like mine on a Sunday morning?" she said. Not hostile, not rhetorical. An actual question asked in the tone of someone who expected an actual answer and was prepared to evaluate whatever she received. Marcus opened his mouth. He had been constructing arguments for a living since before this woman was born, and he did not have one. Not a clean one. Not one that started in the right place and arrived at the right conclusion without passing through a territory he was not ready to map out loud on a front porch on a Sunday morning. He said nothing. She watched him not answer for 3 full seconds. Then she pulled the door open the rest of the way. Not because she had decided to trust him. He understood that clearly. She opened it because a woman who had been managing difficult situations alone for a long time did not manage them by keeping them on the other side of a door. She managed them by letting them in where she could see them. "Come in," she said. He stepped inside. The living room was small and orderly in the way that spaces become orderly when the person maintaining them cannot afford disorder, every surface with a purpose, every object in a place that made sense. He was still taking it in when movement at the end of the short hallway caught his attention. The boy was 6 years old and small, with the careful, watchful eyes of a child who had learned early that paying attention was how you navigated a world that did not always send its signals in the format most people expected. He stopped in the hallway entrance and looked at Marcus with an assessment that was in its directness and its patience remarkably similar to his mother's. Then he turned to Celeste, and his hands moved. The gestures were fluid and specific, not the approximate mime of someone approximating meaning, but genuine language, precise and intentional, the kind that carries grammar inside it. Isaiah was asking something. His expression was serious. He wanted an answer before he decided how to feel about the man standing in his living room. Celeste watched her son's hands. Then she looked at Marcus. "He wants to know who you are," she said, "and whether you're safe." Marcus had faced juries, judges, opposing counsel, who had spent months preparing to dismantle everything he had built. He had sat across tables from people who wanted things from him and people who wanted things taken from him. He had never been asked by anyone whether he was safe. He crossed the room and crouched down until he was at eye level with the boy. He did not know the language Isaiah spoke with his hands. He had no translation to offer, no credential, to present nothing that would mean anything to a 6-year-old who was asking a question that cut straight to the part most adults spent their whole lives talking around. He looked at Isaiah and nodded. Once, slowly. Isaiah considered this for a moment. The nod, the man. Whatever information a child collects through channels that adults have mostly stopped using. Then he looked at his mother. Celeste looked at Marcus. He said he doesn't know yet, she said. It was the most honest answer Marcus had received from anyone in a long time. He stayed crouched for a moment after she said it, because standing up felt like it would end something that was not finished. Then Celeste gestured toward the kitchen. "Sit down," she said. "I need to tell you something before you tell me anything." She paused. About 1993. The chair was the kind you found in dollar stores, in church fellowship halls, in the kitchens of houses where people ate their meals without thinking much about what they were sitting on, because the meal was the point, not the furniture. Plastic, utilitarian. The legs were slightly uneven. On the left side, Marcus could feel it the moment he settled his weight into it, but the chair did not wobble. It absorbed the imbalance and held. He had not sat in a chair like this in 20 years. Celeste did not sit down immediately. She went to the counter beside the refrigerator and picked up a manila folder that was thicker than it had any right to be for something she had assembled in a single morning at a public library. She set it on the table between them, without ceremony, the way you set down something you have been carrying and are ready to stop carrying. She opened it. The top page was a photocopy of the original case, filing the header, the docket number, the names of the parties. On the plaintiff's side, in the font of a document that had been printed and filed and entered into the public record 30 years ago, Meridian Development Group, represented by lead counsel Marcus A. Webb and Associates, New Orleans, Louisiana. His name, his handwriting on the signature line at the bottom of the first page, younger and slightly less controlled than it was now, but unmistakably his. Celeste sat down across from him. She folded her hands on the table in front of her, not clasped, not tense, just placed there the way you place something when you want your hands to be visible and accounted for. She looked at the document, then at him. 200 families, she said. Lower Ninth Ward, 1993. She paused, not for effect, but in the way a person pauses when they are being precise, because precision matters to them. You won. It was not an accusation. It was not a question. It was a statement of documented fact, delivered in the tone of someone who had spent the night before reading every available page of the public record and had arrived at this table prepared to present what she had found clearly and without embellishment. Marcus looked at the document. He did not look away from it, and he did not reach for the deflections that had served him well in every difficult conversation of his professional life. The careful reframing, the contextualizing language, the procedural explanations that were all technically accurate and all somewhat beside the point. He had none of that available to him right now. He was sitting in a plastic chair in a kitchen on Delon Street, and the chair was holding him, and the document was in front of him, and there was nowhere else to direct his attention. "Yes," he said. "I won." Celeste turned to the next page. Another photocopy, the respondent list, households affected by the judgment addresses, and occupant counts, recorded in the dry administrative language of a court proceeding that had never been required to concern itself with what the numbers represented in any terms other than legal ones. She did not read from the list. She did not need to. She knew where her family appeared on it, the way you know the location of a scar. Not because you look at it every day, but because it is part of the geography of your own body, and you do not forget where things like that are. "My family was case number 47, she said. Reginald and Clarice Thibodeau. 2 children. I was 4 years old." The kitchen was quiet. From the back of the house, faint and steady, came the sound of a crayon moving across paper, the soft, purposeful friction of a child working on something that required concentration. Isaiah, in his room, doing what he did when the adults in the house needed the space that children instinctively understand they should leave alone without being told. The sound was small and ordinary, and it filled the silence in the kitchen the way only small, ordinary sounds can completely without trying. Marcus sat with it. He was 64 years old and had been in rooms where hard things were said for most of his adult life. He knew how to hold a position under pressure. He knew how to maintain composure when the other side of the table was trying to take something from him. But Celeste Thibodeau was not trying to take anything from him. She was not performing anger or leveraging grief. She was simply sitting across a kitchen table and telling him what was true, and the only thing he had to offer in response was the same thing, and the same thing was not something he was accustomed to offering without preparation. He did not apologize, not because he did not want to, but because he understood in that moment that an apology from him in this kitchen on this morning would be above all else a way of making the conversation about his discomfort rather than her truth. It was not the right moment for it. He was not sure he had earned the right to it yet. He held her gaze. He held it the way you hold something fragile carefully without gripping. In his jacket pocket, his phone moved against his ribs. A vibration. He reached in without looking away from her face, pulled it out, and turned the screen toward him. Ethan, the fourth time since yesterday morning. He looked at the name on the screen for 1 second. Then, he placed the phone face down on the table between them, in the space beside the open folder, and left it there. The cough came from the back of the house, low, and measured the particular rhythm of it, familiar enough by now that Celeste did not turn her head. But something in her posture shifted the slight, involuntary adjustment of a person whose attention has just been redistributed without their permission. The present tense had reasserted itself through a thin wall and the sound of her mother's lungs. Marcus checked his watch. He had been sitting at this table for 22 minutes. He straightened in the chair and placed both hands flat on the table, the way he did at the start of a meeting when he was ready to move from context to substance. "I want to offer you a position," he said. "Operations coordinator. It's an entry-level management role that has been open at the firm for 4 months because we haven't found the right person for it." He said this without softening it into something it was not. The salary is 3 times your current hourly rate, calculated annually. The benefits package includes full medical and dental coverage for you and your dependents. It includes speech and language therapy, unlimited sessions, no referral required, no annual cap. Celeste did not move. The position requires a general equivalency credential and a 6-month operations certificate. The firm has an employee development fund that covers both tuition materials, examination fees, all of it. The fund has existed for 6 years. The enrollment rate among hourly staff is under 2%, not because people don't want it, but because the information is in a benefits document that most hourly employees never receive, and that the ones who do receive it cannot reasonably be expected to read, because it is 91 pages long and written for people who already understand what they're looking for. He said this the way a man says something he has only recently recognized as a failure and has not yet decided how much of it is his to own. "This is not charity," he said. "This is not because you returned the money. This is because I watched you spend 45 minutes alone with $65,000 in an empty office at 3 in the morning and walk away from it without taking anything that didn't belong to you. And the people I pay 6 figures to manage my operations cannot do what you did in that room, which is see something clearly and make a decision about it without letting what you want get in the way of what's right." Celeste looked at him for a long moment. "You came here because of 1993, she said, "not because of the envelope." Marcus held her gaze. "Both," he said. The word sat between them without elaboration, and Celeste understood that it was the most honest answer he was capable of giving her right now, and that it was more than most people would have offered. She thought about her father, not the specific memory of him, not the Winn-Dixie, not the electrical work, not the particular way he had of explaining things that needed explaining, but the principle of him, the distilled version that had lived in her chest since she was 8 years old and had never stopped being true. What's not yours is not yours. She had built her life around that sentence. She had returned $65,000 on a salary that could not cover her son's medical care because that sentence lived in her body the same way breathing did not, as a choice she made each time, but as a condition of being herself. But she was sitting now in her own kitchen across from a man who was describing something that was by any honest accounting hers. Not given, not charity, not contingent on gratitude or performance of need. Something she had been generating value toward for 3 years, without being told the exchange was possible. What's not yours is not yours. The question that followed it, the one she had never thought to ask before, was, "What is, I don't take things I haven't earned," she said. "You've been earning this for 3 years," Marcus said. "You just weren't told it existed." The room was quiet again, different from the quiet of 20 minutes ago, less heavy, more open, the kind of quiet that collects in a space when something has been said that cannot be unsaid, and both people are deciding what comes next. Celeste turned her head and looked at the wall beside the refrigerator. The waterline was there the way it was always there, 4 feet, 2 inches above the baseboards, pale against the paint. The record of a morning 19 years ago when the city learned something about itself that it had not fully recovered from since. She had looked at that line so many times it had stopped registering as anything other than part of the wall. She looked at it now. "I need time," she said. Marcus nodded once. He pushed back from the table and stood, and Celeste noticed that he did it without the performance of conclusion. No extended hand, no closing statement, no summary of what had been agreed to because nothing had been agreed to. And he understood that well enough not to pretend otherwise. He walked to the front door. He opened it. He stepped through it and onto the porch, and then he stopped 1 full second, maybe 2, standing in the frame with his back to the room before he continued down the steps and onto the street. He did not say anything else. The door swung closed behind him on its own. She was still standing at the closed door when she heard him behind her. Darius had not gone back to his room. He was in the hallway, entrance, arms crossed loosely over his chest, his shoulder resting against the wall with the careful stillness of someone who has been standing in one place long enough to become part of it. The walls in this house were thin, in the way that walls in houses like this were always thin, built to a budget that prioritized standing over insulating separating rooms without actually separating what happened in them. He had heard everything. Celeste turned around and looked at her brother, and something in his expression told her that what he was about to say had been waiting longer than this morning. "Come outside," he said. They sat on the porch steps, not side by side, the way they had 2 mornings ago, but turned slightly toward each other, the way people sit when the conversation requires them to see each other's faces. The street was quiet, in the particular way of a Sunday morning, in a neighborhood where people went to church or went to sleep and did not do much in between. Darius kept his voice low. "When I was at the state correctional facility in Avoyelles Parish," he began, and Celeste noticed that he said it plainly, without the hesitation or the sideways approach that people used when they were ashamed of a thing, which meant he had decided sometime between the hallway and the porch steps that plain was the only way to say this. "I shared a unit for about 14 months with a man named Gerald. He had been a bookkeeper, small firm downtown, did accounting work for a number of different business entities. One of those entities was a company that processed financial transfers for Webb and Associates." Celeste said nothing. She waited. Gerald, Darius explained, had talked, the way men in that situation sometimes talked, not bragging, not confessing, just filling the hours with the kind of detail that reminded you there had been a life before the walls. He had described the arrangement in the particular language of someone who understood numbers better than consequences. Client settlement funds received into escrow, transferred in partial amounts through a series of intermediary accounts, timed to avoid the automated thresholds that triggered compliance review. It was not complicated, Gerald had said. It was just patient. And it had been done more than once, with more than one set of funds, over a period of several years. The name Ethan Webb had come up twice. Darius had not said anything to Celeste when he got out, because he had told himself it was not his business and not his problem, and certainly not hers. He had enough of his own things to navigate without pulling his sister into something that had nothing to do with either of them. He had told himself that enough times that he had started to believe the telling. Then a man had approached him outside the corner store on Claiborne and used his name and his sister's name in the same sentence, and the distance between that story and his life had collapsed entirely. "They don't just want you quiet," Darius said. He was looking at Celeste directly, the way he looked at her when he was not going to let her redirect or minimize. "They want to know if you kept anything. A copy, a photograph, if you told anyone what you saw in that office." "I didn't read it," Celeste said. "I know you didn't. That's not the point." He paused, choosing the next words with care. "The point is they don't know that. And the people who don't know that are the same people who put somebody outside a corner store to talk to a man they knew had terms of supervised release he couldn't afford to violate. The implication was not subtle, and he did not try to make it subtle. There was a version of this situation in which Darius, 3 weeks out of a state facility, and not yet employed and living at his sister's address, became the most convenient kind of pressure. The kind that did not require anyone to say anything directly. The kind that worked by existing. Celeste looked at her brother. He was 29 years old, and he had spent 5 years in a place that had taken things from him that he was still in the process of accounting for. And he was sitting on these porch steps in the Sunday morning quiet and handing her information that could make his situation considerably more complicated, because she was his sister, and that was what you did. "I'm sorry," she said. "Not for any single thing, for the whole shape of it." "Don't," he said, not unkindly. She looked past him, down toward the far end of the block, where Delonde met the cross street. A dark sedan was parked against the curb, about halfway down, angled slightly, not quite parallel the way a car, parked by someone who had not expected to stay long, and then stayed longer than planned. It had been there when she came out. She was not certain it had been there yesterday. She counted the distance from the car to the house. She counted the number of houses between them. She counted the minutes it had been sitting there without moving. Celeste counted everything. She had learned to count the way her father had taught her to count anything that mattered carefully, without rushing, because the number you arrived at was only as reliable as the attention you had paid on the way to it. It was how she managed a budget that did not balance. It was how she managed a shift that ran long. It was, in the end, how she had survived every version of a situation that was not supposed to be survivable. She began to count. She made the call at 7:45 that evening, standing in the kitchen with her work jacket already on and her boots already laced, because she had gotten as far as putting them on before she understood that she was not going to leave. The overnight supervisor picked up on the second ring. Celeste told him she would not be in. She gave no reason. In 3 years of night shifts, she had never missed a single one, and she understood that the absence of explanation, where an explanation had always been unnecessary before, would communicate something on its own. She thanked him and ended the call, and stood in the kitchen for a moment in her jacket and her boots, with nowhere to go. She took the boots off. She hung the jacket on the hook by the door. She sat down at the kitchen table. She did not open the bill folder. She did not make a list. She did not do any of the things she normally did when she sat at this table, because the things she normally did at this table were ways of managing a situation, and tonight she did not have the capacity to manage anything. She just sat there with the full weight of the past 4 days resting on her, the way weather rests on a place not dramatic, not sudden, just present and complete, and not asking for her permission. Darius had gone to bed early. Mama Thee had been asleep since 9. The house was quiet around her, in the way it only was in the deepest part of the night, and Celeste sat in the middle of that quiet and let it be what it was. The knock came at 11 o'clock. 3 soft taps, unhurried, unbothered the knock of someone who was not worried about the hour, because they had decided the hour was not the relevant consideration. Loretta Mae Johnson had lived in apartment 3D, directly across the narrow hallway of the DeLone Street building, for 11 years. She was 65 years old, retired from 28 years of work as a licensed practical nurse at University Medical Center, and she was the kind of woman who noticed things without announcing that she had noticed them. She had watched Celeste Thibodeau move through 3 years of night shifts and sick children and a mother's illness and a brother's return with the particular attention of someone who lived close enough to know the difference between a household that was managing and one that was approaching the outer limit of what managing could hold. She had been listening to footsteps on the other side of the wall since 8 o'clock. When Celeste opened the door, Loretta did not say anything about the hour or offer an explanation for being there. She was wearing her house slippers and a cardigan she had owned long enough that the elbows had gone soft, and she looked at Celeste the way she had always looked at her, directly, without pity, with the steady attention of a woman who had spent nearly 3 decades in emergency rooms and understood that the most useful thing you could offer a person in a difficult moment was your presence without your agenda. She came in. She sat down at the kitchen table across from Celeste. She placed her hand on the table beside Celeste's hand, not on top of it, not grasping it, just near it. Available. I've been watching you carry this alone for 3 years, she said. It's enough. Celeste looked at her. She did not say anything. She did not cry. She had used up whatever that particular resource required a long time ago, in a series of private moments that had each taken something from a reserve she had never fully replenished. But she did not ask Loretta to leave either. And in the economy of that household, where every action was deliberate and nothing was wasted, not asking someone to leave was its own kind of answer. They sat together at the kitchen table, in the way that 2 women sit together when words have been placed on the table and received, and there is nothing left to add to them. At 1 in the morning, there was movement in the hallway. Isaiah appeared at the kitchen entrance, in his pajamas, his hearing aids on the nightstand, in his room, navigating by the low light the way he always did when he woke in the night, carefully using the wall and his own sense of the space he had memorized. He looked at his mother. He looked at Loretta. He assessed the situation with the particular thoroughness of a child who had learned that the adults in his life sometimes needed things that they did not know how to ask for. He turned and went back down the hall. He returned 30 seconds later with a folded piece of paper in his hand, the drawing Celeste had watched him work on for the better part of a week, a circle of yellow sun sitting above a wide curve of blue water, the Mississippi River rendered in the uncomplicated and completely accurate language of a child who had grown up beside it. He crossed the kitchen without hesitation and placed the drawing in his mother's hands. Then he turned around and went back to bed without a word, because he had said what he came to say, and there was nothing else required of him. Celeste looked down at the drawing. The river in it was the same river that had carried the floodwaters into this neighborhood 19 years ago, the same river that had been running through this city for longer than the city itself, indifferent to what happened on its banks, but present for all of it. It had not stopped after the storm. It had not changed course. It had simply continued the way things continued when they were old enough and deep enough to outlast what tried to interrupt them. It was still a river. It was still home. Celeste looked up at Loretta. "If I do this," she said, "I need someone to watch Isaiah and Mama on weekday mornings while I'm at work, and 2 evenings a week while I'm in class." Loretta looked at her for a moment. Then she pushed back from the table. She went to the sink. She picked up the 2 cups that had been sitting on the drying rack since that morning and washed them with the unhurried thoroughness of a woman who did not do anything halfway, and set them upside down on the rack to dry. She did not say yes. She did not say anything at all. She dried her hands on the dish towel hanging from the oven handle, folded it back into place, and sat back down at the table, as if she had always been there and intended to stay. She made the call at 7:45 in the morning, standing at the kitchen counter with a cup of coffee she had not yet touched. 2 rings. Then his voice measured, unhurried, the voice of a man who had been awake for a while and was not surprised to hear from her. "This is Celeste Thibodeau," she said. "I'll take the position." A pause. Not a long one. The kind that comes from a person absorbing something they had hoped for, but not assumed. "Monday," Marcus said. 7:45. "I'll be there," she said. She set the phone down on the counter and stood with both hands wrapped around the coffee cup. Across the kitchen, Isaiah was at the table, with a bowl of cereal, his hearing aids, in working through his breakfast, with the focused attention he brought to most things. He was wearing the blue shirt, with the pocket on the front, that he preferred above all other shirts, and would wear every day if she let him. He did not look up. He did not know that anything had changed. He was 6 years old, and it was a Monday morning, and there was cereal in his bowl, and his mother was in the kitchen, and those were the coordinates of a world that was at this particular moment exactly as it should be. Celeste watched him eat. She thought about what it would look like in 6 months. Not the specifics, not the salary, or the certificate program, or the details Marcus had laid out at her kitchen table the morning before, just the shape of it. The general shape of a life in which the number on the right side of the equation had changed, in which a phone call to a specialist did not require 3 days of recalculating the budget before she could make it, in which Isaiah's world could stay exactly as it should be, not because she had managed to hold everything together by the narrowest possible margin, but because the margin had widened into something that did not require her full strength just to maintain. She took a sip of the coffee. It had gone slightly cool. She drank it anyway. The morning passed, the way Monday mornings passed, in that house. School preparation, medication schedules, the particular logistics of a household that ran on precision because it could not afford to run on anything else. By early afternoon, the house was quiet. Mama Thee was resting. Isaiah was down for a nap. Darius had gone out to follow up on a job lead. He had not said much about the kind of careful optimism that people practice when they have been disappointed enough times to stop announcing their hopes before they have a reason to. At 2:40 in the afternoon, Darius came back through the front door and did not say anything. He went straight to the kitchen window and looked out at the street for a moment. Then he went to the back of the house without explanation. Celeste was still at the kitchen table when the knock came at 3 o'clock. She knew before she opened the door. Not because she had specific information, but because she had been counting things for 4 days, and the count had been pointing toward this for long enough that the arrival of it felt less like surprise and more like the last number in a sequence finally showing up. Ethan Webb was dressed for an office. He had presumably left early, his jacket still on, his expression arranged into something that was professionally warm, in the way that expressions are professionally warm when the person wearing them has rehearsed it for a specific purpose. He was 31 years old and had the particular ease of someone who had never had to wonder whether a room was going to accommodate him, because every room he had ever walked into had been arranged in one way or another to do exactly that. "Ms. Thibodeau," he said, "I apologize for coming by unannounced. I just wanted to make sure there was no misunderstanding about the envelope." Celeste did not step back from the door. She did not invite him in immediately. She held the frame the same way she had held it 2 mornings ago with his father, as a position, not a courtesy. "What misunderstanding?" she said. Something moved briefly behind his eyes. He recovered it quickly. He was good at recovering things quickly, and continued in the same measured register. He talked about the sensitive nature of certain firm matters, about the value of discretion in situations involving internal documentation, about his appreciation for her professionalism, and his hope that they could come to a mutual understanding about the note she had found alongside the funds. He did not say the word on the note. He did not need to. Celeste stepped back from the door, not because she was yielding, because what was coming needed space. Ethan stepped inside. Marcus came out of the kitchen. The 2 men looked at each other, across the length of the living room, and the air in the space between them changed in a way that had nothing to do with Celeste and everything to do with 30 years of a particular kind of relationship, the kind where one person built something and another person grew up inside it, and both of them had always understood the arrangement without saying so out loud. Dad, one word, flat. The money, Marcus said. Not a question. The Williams family settlement. That's what was in the envelope. Ethan's jaw tightened. It's handled. It is not handled, Marcus said, in the voice he used when he had already arrived at the end of an argument and was simply waiting for the other person to catch up. $65,000 belonging to a family in this neighborhood has been sitting in the wrong account for 8 months, and the woman standing in this room found it and returned it without keeping a single dollar of it and without knowing whose it was. It's handled, Dad. The repetition had an edge in it now. I grew up 2 blocks from the Williams family, Celeste said. Neither man spoke. She had not raised her voice. She had not moved from where she was standing. She had simply said the true thing in the plain way her father had taught her to say true things. And the sentence had landed in the room the way sentences land when they are the exact weight of the situation they are describing. The back door opened. Darius walked in from the kitchen with his phone in his hand, the screen facing outward, a small red indicator light showing at the top. He had been standing in the back hallway since 2:40. He had come in through the rear entrance before Ethan arrived, and he had been there quiet and still for the full length of the conversation. I think we should call someone who can handle this properly, he said. His voice was even, unhurried, the voice of a man who had spent 5 years learning that the most powerful thing you could do in a room was stay calm when everyone else expected you not to. I already have a number. Darius had made the call before he left the house on Deslone Street. The man he reached was a staff attorney at a non-profit legal aid organization in Mid-City, someone assigned to Darius during his re-entry process, who had, over the course of 3 weeks, demonstrated the one quality Darius had learned to value above everything else. He showed up when he said he would and did what he said he would do. In a life that had not always offered a reliable supply of either, that was not a small thing. The audio file reached the Louisiana State Bar Association's Office of Disciplinary Counsel by Tuesday morning, submitted under Darius's name, with the attorney listed as counsel of record. The process, once initiated, belonged to the state. It did not require Marcus Webb's participation. It did not ask his permission. Marcus did not know any of this when he arrived at his office at 6:50 Tuesday morning and sat down with the 1993 file on his left and the Williams family settlement documentation on his right. He had pulled the Williams file the previous evening. He was reading it now for the second time because the first time he had not been ready to see all of it. The settlement had cleared 8 months ago. $65,000 net of fees due to Gloria and Raymond Williams of Jourdan Avenue, Lower 9th Ward, a family that had spent 7 years waiting for money that was already theirs. The funds had entered escrow on a Wednesday. By Friday, they had been moved. The internal notation explaining the movement was written in language that meant nothing to anyone who did not already know what it meant. Ethan came in without knocking. He sat across from his father and leaned forward in the measured, reasonable register he used when he wanted something complicated to sound simple. This can be handled quietly, he said. The funds can be returned. A correction can be filed. Nobody needs to. The Williams family waited 7 years, Marcus said. Dad, 7 years. Not louder, just clearer. For money that was already theirs. Quietly is not an option. Ethan held his gaze. You built this firm by knowing when to be quiet. That's not a criticism. That's just what you did. And that's why there's a firm to be sitting in right now. Marcus looked at his son for a long moment. He saw a man who was competent and careful, and who had learned from watching his father that the purpose of skill was to protect the position you had built with it. He saw a man who had been given every advantage and had never once been required to reckon with what those advantages had cost someone else. He saw himself, 30 years ago, walking out of a courthouse in the lower 9th Ward. I built this firm on people who couldn't fight back, Marcus said. I told myself the law was neutral, and I was just applying it. I was wrong about that for a long time. He picked up the desk phone. I'm done. He dialed the direct line for the Bar Association's Ethics Division, a number he had never called and had never expected to call and knew by memory because he made it his business to know every number that mattered. The call connected on the second ring. Ethan did not move. He sat there while his father reported in plain and precise language a violation of professional conduct by a junior partner at the firm. Case number, dates, amounts, his own name as the reporting party. When Marcus hung up, the office was quiet. Ethan stood. He said nothing. He walked to the door and went through it, and the sound of it closing was the sound of something that had been a long time coming and had finally arrived. Marcus opened the bottom drawer of his desk. Beneath a folder he had not touched in 4 years was a plain white envelope, slightly soft at the corners. Patricia's handwriting on the front. His name in the unhurried cursive of a woman who always knew where her sentences were going. He had placed this letter in this drawer 4 years ago because he had understood standing at a hospital reception desk while someone handed him her personal effects in a plastic bag that he was not ready to read it. He had checked periodically over 4 years. He unfolded it now. One paragraph, her handwriting slightly uneven at the end, the way it had been the pen moving with intention, even when the hand holding it had lost some of its steadiness. He read it once slowly, the way she had taught him to read anything that mattered. He folded it along the same crease. He held it for a moment. He set it on the desk. Then he looked up at the window. 30 floors below, the city moved through its Tuesday morning without asking his permission. The buses, on their routes, the streets of the lower Ninth Ward, going about the business of a neighborhood that had survived things that were supposed to end it and had not been given sufficient credit for either. It was farther down than he had realized. He was not sure when he had stopped noticing. The desk had a small scratch on the upper right corner, a thin line in the laminate barely visible, unless the light caught it at a particular angle. Celeste noticed it on her first morning because she had spent 3 years noticing things about surfaces that other people sat down at without looking. She knew this desk. She knew the underside of it better than she knew the top. She sat down anyway. She opened the laptop they had assigned her and looked at the login screen and began. The first month was the kind of difficult that did not announce itself dramatically. It was the difficulty of learning a language that everyone around you had been speaking for years. The internal communications platform, the logistics, management software, the particular shorthand of a workplace that had developed its own vocabulary over time and used it without thinking, because everyone already knew what it meant. Everyone except her. She did not ask for help more than once on any single thing. She found the user manuals in the shared drive on her third day and read them, the way she read everything important, completely, without skipping, making notes in the margin of a legal pad she kept beside the keyboard. She watched tutorial recordings on her lunch break, her phone propped against her coffee cup, working through the software one module at a time. Speaking of lunch, she ate it sitting down now, at a table in the break room, for a full 30 minutes, the way the employee handbook said she was entitled to. It was a small thing. It did not feel small. 3 weeks into the position, she took Isaiah to his first appointment with Dr. Renee Okafor, a speech and language pathologist who had been doing this work for 19 years and who had learned over the course of those 19 years that the first session with a new child was not about what the child could say. It was about what the child needed you to understand before they would consider saying anything at all. Isaiah did not speak at the first session. He sat across from Dr. Okafor at a low table and looked at her with the careful, evaluating attention he brought to all new situations. And then he picked up a crayon blue, his preference, and drew. Dr. Okafor watched him draw without commenting. When he set the crayon down, she looked at the paper for a long moment. A circle of yellow sun above a wide curve of blue water. "He's already communicating," she said, looking up at Celeste, who was observing from a chair against the wall. "We just need to find the bridge." Celeste nodded. She had known this. She had been building the bridge herself with library books and index cards and a list on the refrigerator for 2 years. What she had not known was whether someone with the proper tools and training would be able to see what she had been building and continue it. Dr. Okafor saw it in the first session. That was enough. On a Thursday afternoon in the 4th week, in a small conference room at the nonprofit legal aid office in Mid-City, Gloria Williams sat down at a table across from Robert Arsenault and received a check for $65,000. Gloria Williams was 68 years old and had spent 7 of those years in a legal process that had asked her repeatedly and without apology to be patient with a system that scheduled her life in continuances and adjournments and letters that said her case was progressing without specifying toward what. She had been patient. She had not had the option of being anything else. She looked at the check for 3 full minutes without picking it up. Robert did not rush her. He sat across the table and let her look at it for as long as she needed to, because he understood that some things required more than a moment to become real, and that the correct response to that was not to move things along. She picked it up. She folded it once. She placed it in the inside pocket of her jacket, close to her chest, and she thanked him in the quiet voice of a woman who had been waiting long enough that the arrival of the thing she was waiting for required a moment of private acknowledgement before it could become a fact she shared with anyone else. Celeste did not know about this moment when it happened. She was in a conference room on the 14th floor, sitting at the far end of a long table, listening to a logistics review meeting that had been scheduled for 45 minutes and had already run over by 12. She had not spoken. She had taken 4 pages of notes in the compressed shorthand she had developed for herself over years of managing more information than she had space to store. When the meeting ended, she did not leave with the others. She stayed at the table after the room cleared, looking at the distribution map projected on the screen at the far end, a web of routes and nodes and timing windows that represented the movement of freight through 11 parishes over the course of a standard business week. She had been looking at maps like this for 3 years, not on screens, on floors, on loading docks at 11 at night, in the gaps between where the trucks were supposed to be and where they actually were when she was mopping the warehouse corridor and counting the way she always counted the minutes that did not add up. She saw it in the routing sequence for Tuesday and Thursday afternoons, a gap between the loading dock schedule and the driver dispatch window, 40 minutes recurring invisible to anyone who had only ever seen the map from the top down and never from the ground up. She stayed at the table for 10 minutes after the last person left. Then she walked back to her desk, opened her laptop, and began to type. She was not asking for someone's opinion on what she had seen. She was not flagging it as a question. She was writing a report, structured, specific, supported by 3 years of floor-level observation that no consultant and no analyst and no person who had only ever moved through this building, from the elevator to the conference room, had any reason to have. This was not the version of herself that asked whether she was allowed to take up space. This was the version that already had. 6 months later, Isaiah grabbed her hand before she finished her first cup of coffee. He had been up for 20 minutes already. She could tell by the way he moved with the settled energy of a child who had been awake long enough to have a plan. He took her by the wrist and pulled her through the kitchen and out to the small back landing that served as a porch. The apartment on the Harp Street in the Treme was the first place Celeste had chosen entirely on her own terms. East-facing windows that caught the early light before the rest of the city was ready for it. She had noticed the light on the first walkthrough and said nothing to the landlord because it was the reason she signed the lease, and she did not need him to know that. Mama Thee was already outside, sitting with both hands around her coffee, her face turned toward the morning. She had completed her final treatment cycle 11 weeks ago. The oncologist had used the word encouraging. Mama Thee had nodded the way she nodded at most things, without excess, without performance. She was not carrying a medication bag this morning. Her hands were just hands, again holding just a cup. Across the city, Darius was pulling his work van onto a construction site on Jordan Avenue, new housing going up in the lower 9th Ward, under a program that hired men with records, because the director understood that the people most qualified to rebuild a neighborhood were frequently the ones the neighborhood had already produced. His employer knew his history. He had not asked Darius to minimize it. 4 months in, the foreman had stopped watching him like someone he was uncertain about and started watching him like someone he was counting on. On Canal Street, Marcus stood on the sidewalk in front of the building that carried his name and looked at the new panel beside the entrance. Thibodaux Community Legal Aid, free services for lower 9th Ward residents. No announcement, no gathering, just a contractor with a drill and 40 minutes on a Tuesday morning. Marcus had not told Celeste about the name. He had not asked her permission. It was not a gesture requiring her approval. It was an acknowledgement requiring his honesty. And this was the form that honesty took. Isaiah let go of her wrist when they reached the railing. He stood beside her and looked out at the morning, the rooftops of the Treme, the gold, unhurried light falling across the city, the way it fell across everything here, without preference, without reservation. He raised his arm and pointed at the sky. Celeste looked up. The sun was there low and bright, exactly where his finger indicated exactly where it had been in every drawing he had made of it, across 2 years of learning to say what his hands already knew. He opened his mouth, not his hands, his mouth. Mama, a breath. Sun, 2 words, imperfect, present, spoken into the morning air above a city that had survived its own undoing more than once and was still on mornings like this one something worth pointing at. Celeste did not clap. She did not say good job or any of the things that would have made the moment about her response, rather than his voice. She looked up at where his finger was pointing, and she saw the sun exactly where he said it was. Exactly where he said it was. Later that morning, she brought his drawing to the new kitchen on La Harpe Street, the one he had placed in her hands on a Sunday night when she could not sleep and did not have words for what she was carrying, and pressed it against the refrigerator door with a strip of tape. Below it, the current vocabulary list. Beside it, the $20 bill her mother had pressed into her hand years ago. Buy yourself something that isn't for anyone else. Still unspent, still folded along its original crease, still worth more as a fact than as currency. 3 things on a refrigerator door in a kitchen full of morning light. A drawing, a list, a bill, everything she had carried, everything that had carried her back. Some people move through this world alone because they learned early and thoroughly that asking for help costs more than the help is worth. They learn to count instead of asking, to carry instead of reaching, to build the thing themselves because waiting for someone to offer it has never once worked out the way it was supposed to. If this story stayed with you, if it put a face on someone you have been moving past without seeing say their name, not as an apology, as a beginning, and if you have been the one carrying, this one was for you.